Hello, everybody. Welcome to this impromptu Q&A session. It's been a while since I've done anything like this, and if you've ever seen our Patreon, you will know that this is something that's supposed to be part of the Patreon thing, is a regular Q&A session. So I'm going to share a brewski with you and get answering some questions. So I've seen a couple come through from patrons. So if you are one of our patrons on Patreon, thank you so much to begin with. But also, when we do these sessions, and I'm going to make these a bit more regular, the questions are going to be for patrons first, and then when those questions are all answered, then we'll move on to something that's a bit more available to the floor, as it were. Hello to my regular viewer, the Bommel. Good to see you. Stupid question. Bommel, you've not been playing Star Trek Fleet Command, have you? Because I have. And one of the people in my armada is called Bommel, and I thought that was just a really weird coincidence. So, anyway, off topic already, and we've been on stream about 3 seconds. So, I'm going to have a quick look on the post on Patreon. Patreon.com/HopPoleStudios for anyone who wasn't aware. And whilst I dig up what these questions are, how do I get to them? Then let's roll the intro. Okay, cool. So, the background noise you can hear tonight is mostly from the laptop. I've got the Arturia audio fuse being incredibly sensitive, and it is picking up everything that goes on in this room, and this poor laptop is cranked as per usual. Anyway, let's get straight to the first question. Each one of these questions is probably going to be quite long, quite detailed. I think that's the purpose of tonight's stream, rather than answering YouTube comments with a few sentences. I'm going to get really into the weeds and really quite detailed. So, without further rambling, first question up from one of our patrons, Andrew Mortimer, who says, question 1, suggestions for mic choice and placement for recording cello. Now, that's a very good question, and it's not got a one-size-fits-all answer, so there's plenty of time now for me to try and elaborate on exactly what I would do. First question is, cello, yes, but what genre? Are we talking classical? Are we talking like cello for like apocalyptica and metal recording, or are we talking something more for film sound or experimental? A lot of what I tend to do in terms of microphones and distance and all that kind of stuff really depends on the piece. The way that it is in mind, which is why it's always good to do a bit of pre-production, try and get a feel for what the song or piece is and how it's going to feel in the end. But for some easy kind of defaults in my mind, something like a cello, because it resonates so much, it actually depends more on the room than anything. I would say, again, it really depends on what you're going for, but if you want natural kind of realism and you want it to be in mono as well, then I would keep it simple, and I would have a really nice high-class ribbon, probably in front of the player, about 2 feet away from the cello, roughly at kind of just above bridge level. So kind of if I was sat down in front of the cellist, it would be kind of here. You can't see it. Just basically aiming roughly at the body of the cello, because from 2 feet away, from 24 inches away, that's enough distance that would give me a much broader overall sound of the cello. But it's also far enough away that it will start to incorporate quite a bit of the sound of that room, which is why I would try and find a relatively large, relatively diffuse sounding room. A room that basically isn't going to provide too much of its own character to overwhelm the sound of said cello. Because the more room sound you have, whether it's a more reflective room or whether it's a smaller room, especially, which keeps all the sound waves really kind of in close, in basically in a small room, no matter how far away you get the microphone, you're just going to get more and more and more room sound, and it's going to be really hard to deal with. But it's one of those things where if you've got a decent sized room, you can then start doing things like gentle compression on something like a cello source without that then bringing the room sound up when you adjust levels. That really depends. Alternatively, a not too bright large diaphragm condenser, like a Slate ML1 in U47 mode, might be quite nice in that same position. It depends what you're going for. Again, like I say, if you want something that's a bit larger than life, you might want to start then thinking about it more like you would with an acoustic guitar, where you might have a small diaphragm condenser 12 inches from the middle of the fretboard, and maybe another one lower down near just below the bridge to try and get a lot of low body resonance to mix in. Being very careful to make sure they're quite phase coherent. So closer means it'll be much more present. It'll have much more of that raw sound. If there's anything like wolf tones in the strings, you'll get more bowing noise if that's what you want, if you're closer. If you're further away, then you tend to get less of that and you get a much more pleasant overall sound. But then you need a more sensitive mic or a good ribbon mic. You can really, if you want to lift that high end, use a nice EQ like a Neve EQ, like this Brit N here actually, to bring out top end detail without bringing too much nastiness out, which can be a problem with something like a cello, which does have some relatively harsh tones up in the 3K, 4K region that are not necessarily too bright on their own, but if you start to add a microphone that accentuates those, that can lead to problems when that multiply. So if you try and lift high end, any kind of detail there becomes a caricature of itself. So yeah, a nice ribbon or a nice not too bright large diaphragm condenser are what I would go for on a cello. I mean, if you've got a pair of them, I would tend to put them in the same spot with a kind of an XY pattern, so you're not getting any weird stereo-ness, because again, and generally on something like a cello, you might be aiming for a more natural sound. Whereas with a drum kit, you might put microphones meters apart to get a big stereo sound. With an instrument that is a spot source, generally, unless you're going for really weird pop production on anything like that, you don't want it to sound a million miles wide. So you don't want to be starting to do crazy stereo stuff. You tend to want to keep them on a stereo bar, with either XY or ORTF or something like that. Something that's relatively sane sounding, shall we say. And next question, number 2, do you use any compression when tracking vocals, and how much gain reduction? This is another one that's a very long and detailed question, because there is no easy answer. The default answer from me is yes. I use compression pretty much every time that I track vocals. Which compressors I use and how much really depend on who the singer is, what the genre is, what's needed. Generally, the more aggressive sounding the genre, the more aggressive the compression on the vocals, because I want the singer to be able to hear themselves clearly over the track, but at the same time, I don't necessarily want it where they belt a big note out and absolutely blow out their own headphones, which not only will cause them some discomfort, but will invariably make them go sharp, or generally sharp rather than flat. If you blast notes out and the volume gets into your ears too loud, you naturally start to go sharp. It's a phenomenon that I've certainly noticed, that I make singers in the studio now have their volume on their headphones lower rather than higher, and I always find that they give a much better performance. If I get a singer saying, "Can you turn the headphones up? I can't hear myself," red flag. They do not need more of their own vocal. They need less of the backing track. They need room for their ears to breathe, and just stop them and explain that to them. And then just say, "Trust me, try it." Because 9 times out of 10, if you just give them more volume of themselves, they then can't hear the track. They get more of the track, they can't hear themselves, but everything's then so loud. Not only is it massively spilling onto the microphone, but it's causing them to have pitch issues because it's so damn loud. So that's a thing. But yes, getting back to the question, more specifically, in my mind, there's kind of a gamut of compressors. And the Slate Virtual Mix Rack is a really good wait for me to show this to you. So I'm going to make my camera a little smaller. And behind me here, you can actually see the very vocal chain that I'm using right now. I'm using compression on my vocal right now. But with this being a voiceover, it would sound rather strange if I just absolutely slammed the compression. But I'm going to do that. This is what I would call a relatively soft compressor. This is one side of the coin, and then there's a full gamut right through to, oh my word, you are killing it. And so let's go from this one. I'll turn this compressor off now, so you'll hear some more dynamics in my vocal now, which is fine, but it's just a little different. And here's the monster, which is the absolute opposite, and suddenly this is going absolutely bananas. And if I talk really quietly, you can hear me like that. And if I talk really loudly, it doesn't get any louder in the headphones because it really is an absolutely smashing compressor. It's an 1176 with all buttons in. And I'm actually finding it quite hard to do this because it's... there we go. It's making me feel out of breath because it's so heavy compression that it's quite claustrophobic. That's what I find anyway. And I find too much compression like that quite hard to track a singing vocal with. Generally, what I do is I do have the vocal slightly louder than the rest of the mix in the singer's headphones anyway, so they don't need huge amounts of compression. But if you've ever seen any of my mix tutorials, you'll see that I use several compressors in a row on vocals. And that's not just a mix decision, that's part of a tracking decision. So what might happen is I might end up with 3 compressors on the vocals. So here's the other one. So I'm going to turn this compressor off as well. So this is what I would call my normal tracking compressor. Hello to Mage Prometheus in chat. So this is more of a vintage 1176. I would tend to have the attack somewhere in the middle, release really, really fast. The attack and release on 1176 are backwards for anyone that didn't know. 1 is really slow, 7 is really fast. Anywho, how much do I have in terms of gain reduction in dB? That's a hard one to answer as well, because that depends how much level I'm giving you from my vocal. A good vocal performance, I tend to find, is actually quite dynamic. And some people say, oh, well, you should teach the singer to be, a better singer. Bollocks. If you've got a really good vocalist, they're going to emote and perform as is necessary. And the volume difference can be 20 decibels or more from a big section to a quiet section. And I genuinely don't think that a singer should be doing this kind of big mic technique thing, because it screws around with the proximity effect, because most of the microphones that we use on vocals have a cardioid pickup pattern. And what that means is it picks up much more from the front than it does the back. But it also means that there's this proximity effect. If I get really, really close, there's loads and loads of bass. If I'm really, really far back, I have to raise my voice, but there's a lot less low end. So if I start doing this with big notes, and then my soft notes are really like here, that screws around with the mixing, because then I've got to automate things. So I've got to automate low end away from this section and add low end in on this section, or it's going to sound thin. I don't want that. I want the singer to be in one place, to have a consistent tone, and then I want to let the compressors do their job. But that means on this, if I do a relatively soft vocal here, you see that apart from one vowel there, the needle on the 76 is not moving, and the amount of gain reduction is 0. But if I do a big vocal, suddenly that was at kind of 15 dB, which is a huge amount. Apologies if that distorted as well, because I'm only using the one compressor. If I bring in this opto as well, that one's going pretty crazy, but that one's going pretty crazy on the more evened out signal. If I blast this again with more of a level, that's 15 dB there and 15 dB there, so that's 30 decibels of gain reduction, and it still doesn't feel particularly over compressed in my headphones. I might back the threshold off on the opto a little so that now the output's a little too loud, so I'll take that down. But with an 1176 and something akin to an LA2A compressor, your compression when you're tracking vocals can be anywhere from nothing at all to a good 30 decibels of compression. And then in a mix, I would probably put the Monster on afterwards, which is really bringing up that noise floor in here, which is why professional studios have the singer tracking in a silent, and I mean silent, vocal booth, because even the slightest thing comes up really, really loud. But that also means that, especially over something like a dense rock mix where there's a lot going on, every single syllable comes to the front. Every single emotion, quote unquote, is right there in your face. It's quite aggressive. It's quite overbearing. And that's when you start having to do very heavy editing of taking out breaths and things in between vocals. But when you've got a wall of sound coming from crashing drums and heavy guitars and all that kind of stuff, that's what's necessary in a mix. But that's where I will have a very aggressive compressor come after the others. And so that's pretty much my general tracking chain there. That's not a compressor, that's just some saturation. I would EQ into these, so I might take a bit more low end out now that I'm compressing really hard. The mid push there was just a personal choice. If I turn the headphones up so that I can hear it a bit better, it does sound like it doesn't need that mid forward push there, that radio effect if I really kill it. But the Neve EQ is very broad, so I can just add a dB or two at that point. And I've got a little bit nice low end going in from, again, Mr. Neve and Co. by way of Slate Digital. But yes, hopefully that answers the question. I always use compression and have done for 15 years in the box whilst tracking. It's something you have to keep an eye on is latency. Some plugins add extra latency. Virtual Mix Rack does not. Where it says 0 samples here, that's how many samples of latency a plugin is adding. And Reaper is very, very, very good indeed. I'm going to turn that 1176 off because that's making me feel a little bit but yeah, the overall samples of extra latency that plugins can add. Some do, some don't. Good example, if I add in Slate's FGX, I'm just going to add that in there, and you can suddenly see that's got 256 samples of latency being added. I'm going to take that away again. And that's the kind of thing where they stack up, and that can cause problems. So what I do also tend to do when I'm tracking vocals is I use a couple of different reverbs. So I tend to send my track. I'll just mute them for a second. So I'll have Verb Suite Classics or something like that by Slate, and I'll have one channel. I'll just close these. One channel that's the classic A plate by Lexicon, but then I'll have another channel that is the Bricasti M7 using Studio B Close. And I also do tend to throw EQs after these just to get rid of the low end. So these are going to be way too much. There we go, yeah, way too much. So if I take that all the way down, that room reverb, that's killing the room reverb, but that suddenly means that in a dense mix, even in a dead vocal booth, I suddenly feel more comfortable. I feel like I can breathe properly because that's not suddenly stuffy and mono. And then so if I bring that down until it's quite reasonable, and then there's the plate reverb, which is too much. But if I put that in a little bit, there we go. This with a nice bit of compression, a bit of a short room reverb, and a nice sizzly plate is how I would tend to track vocals for a lot of people, because that's really that's why they call it comfort reverb, because it does feel quite nice now. I mean, I'm not going to leave this on for the entire session, but between those and the compression, that's how I track vocals every time, because I tend to find that having all that going live makes singers feel better. They feel much more natural. They get into the groove quicker. They can pitch themselves better. Something Bommel did mention is having only one ear on headphone tracking, and I do tend to find that works differently for different singers. I used to be a one headphone only person. Then I found that I spent some time getting the mix right for me. And once I got that breathing space and the not overly compressed thing, but whilst I could still hear myself over the mix, which helped from turning the, not just turning the headphones down, but because I work with more of an analog level at kind of 12, minus 15, where I used to work a lot louder, I do tend to find that I can hear myself over the track now without straining. And that helps me to sing in the vocal booth a lot better. And that's translated over to my clients. So, yes, hopefully that's answered those questions. Any more questions from anybody? David Imrie from the Council of Davids has said that eBay has really dried up again, bargain gear-wise. Yeah, eBay tends to go through phases, I find. And eBay's bargains have always gone through phases. I've been a bit of an eBay fiend in terms of getting bargains now for a decade. A lot of the studio, and I'm not exaggerating, a lot of the studio has come from eBay, bit by bit by bit. Not all of it, obviously, but a lot of things now do tend to come from gear reviews, and then I'll pay the people who, sent them over, so I don't have to send them back. But then also some of the gear is from my alternative source of really nice things, which is Facebook Marketplace. Now, Facebook Marketplace is much more of what you might call a crapshoot. It's a lot more of a gamble, not in terms of what the equipment is, but how the sellers are going to be, because it doesn't have an established structure like eBay does, where there's where there's a process and then there's a possibility of returns and all that kind of stuff. It's a bit more like the Wild West. But if you're going to find bargains, Facebook Marketplace is a great place to find a good bargain, but you've got to be patient. You've got to know what it is you're looking for. Whereas with eBay, you can kind of be scrolling and finding things. You've got to know from the way that somebody puts stuff on there whether they're going to be an absolute melon, or you've just got to be aware of exactly what it is that you want. And I generally find I get the best deals on Facebook Marketplace by driving to meet the people. The JCM 800 Studio and the 5150 that I was tracking with this week both came from Facebook Marketplace. One was a trade and one was cash outright. And they've been absolutely fantastic. The 61 key Studio Logic keyboard that's next to me, I got from Facebook Marketplace. I think I paid 20 quid for it, which is, bargain. Whereas with eBay, I tend to find that prices have gone up significantly. Going back to question from earlier, Major Prometheus, when we was talking about recording vocals with compression, do you record the vocal DI and the compressed signal? That's not how it works. You see all the stuff that I'm tracking with, that doesn't get recorded. That stays as a plugin on the Reaper channel strip so that I'm tracking through it, but that's not being baked into the file. That means that I have the original vocal signal being recorded in it, and then when I go back and press play, it runs it back through this compression and vocal chain again. Benefit of that is that I can then undo the compression, or I can change any of the settings, or I can delete that plugin entirely, or I can keep it. Downside is that when you do that 100 times over 100 tracks, the amount of processing that you need tends to stack up, which has always been an issue, but I've always preferred having to deal with that amount of processing power and leave all my options open. But from time to time, I will do something else. Actually, if I make one of these tracks a little bit bigger, there we go. You can see there's a little button that says in FX on a track that you can see just on the left here. And if I had stuff in there, that will actually record onto the file as it records, which can be good in terms of committing, but also the downside is once it's done, it's done. And in that case, you might want to record 2 tracks, one as a DI. But because I already have the DI, quote unquote, the way that I do it, that seems redundant and just a little extra. Cool. Hello to Comet, the Savvy Optician. This being a Q&A session, do feel free to get your questions in this evening. It's nice for a bit of a chill out session. So let's see. Hello, David Ross from the Council of Davids. Let's have a look. Just for the headphones, then, yeah. But how to explain this? So because I'm recording with this enabled, I can hear it, but that doesn't mean it's just for the monitoring. I don't do things just for the benefit of the tracking for the singer or whoever. If I'm getting a sound, I'm generally getting the sound to be used, full stop. I act as if I was recording to tape. I try and get the sound so it's the best sound I can possibly get that I would be prepared to record onto the tape, so that then afterwards I add on top of that with an extra layer if I'm going to mix. Which then seems a little redundant that I am adding extra work to the processor when I then go back and press play, but that's just keeping my options open. Like I said, I might want to keep the performance, but eventually just go back and redo the whole vocal plugin chain. It's been known to happen, especially if you've seen these mixes I've been doing the last couple of weeks, where I've gone back to really old mixes and been able to peel them right back to the original raw performances and rebuild them with more modern plugins, processes. I might come back to some of the mixes with clients I do now, 5 or 10 years from now, just out of interest, with whatever's available then that isn't available now. So I do like to keep stuff that is as close to raw, if not completely raw, as possible, as well as everything else. But modern computers are so powerful now that that's not been an issue for me for years, that I will just rack up all the processors, all the plugins, all the work from raw all the way up. And that's why I end up with 10 or 15 little things on a track, like, gate, then a... Ooh, what did I do? What did I do? There we go. Press the wrong button. From a gate to a saturator to an EQ to 2 compressors to a channel strip. Then I might go out to a de-esser. Then I might go out to another compressor. Then I might go out to another EQ. But that sounds like too much, but it's because the way that I imagine it, up to let's just say like where this red compressor is. After that, let's get rid of the monster. Let's just say this is what it might sound like if I was tracking through a vintage desk. So I had a gate as an insert on my nice tube preamp, which had a Neve EQ, which had an 1176, and then an LA2A going through a Neve console. And then I might have something like a virtual tape machine. So I'm tracking to tape. For me then, in my mind, that's then done. And then when you get to the mixing stage, anything you do beyond that is what you would have done as a mixing engineer. So I might end up with, so that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, plus a tape machine, that's 7 plugins. Then I'd have another EQ, another compressor, maybe a de-esser. That's 10. And that sounds like an absolute gong show. That sounds ridiculous. But if the way that I was doing it, if I was tracking to a tape machine in the analog world, I might be using 7 of those in the real world to get to tape. And then when you move to the mixing process, in your mind, you're starting from 0. So then when they say, oh, I only used 1 EQ and 1 compressor, why don't you only use 1 EQ and 1 compressor? Then it's like, well, yeah, but the tracking engineer used 6 or 7 different things. Add it all up. As long as each move is tasteful, appropriate, and not overdoing it, then yeah, don't worry about it. Okay, so a question from David Ross. Is there any issue with recording straight into an interface as opposed to using a DI box? Both my DI and interface are cheap. So, yes. Cheap interfaces. Let's say your interface is slightly older than the brand new top-of-the-line ones like the Audion Evo 4. Let's say it's a little older, like a first-generation Focusrite Scarlett or something like that. They retail at, £100, $120. Once you take the tax off that, and then you take off Focusrite's profits, then you take off the factory's profits and all that kind of thing, it's probably a $20 box. So always try and put out of your mind what you paid for it. Try and think of what the parts are actually worth. If you buy a $2,000 interface, once tax and the profits are taken off, it's probably a $1,000 box. If you've got a $120 box and you take tax and profits and everything off, it's probably a $20 box. So, and in that case, the DI section of that interface is probably a cheap afterthought. It's probably a single cheap 1 mega ohm resistor tacked in front of what goes to the mic preamp section. Whereas if you look at a real nice separate DI box, they can be the size of 2 fists with a big transformer in and discrete circuitry, all that kind of stuff, which is designed to change not just the impedance, but the entire interface of something like a guitar to a very low noise, crystal clear, high bandwidth microphone signal. which can then be fed into relatively inexpensive mic preamps, which can then use relatively little amounts of gains, if not any extra gain, to bring that up to be a usable signal. If DI recording is your thing, if recording, say, electric guitars with virtual amps or something like that is your biggest thing, see if I can pull one of these out here. Get yourself. I'm just going to pull this out. This is my recommendation to you. Orchid Electronics micro direct inject boxes. Orchid Electronics, I think it's .co.uk, UK based. They hand make these, I think. They make them in massive batches. They're incredibly good quality, and they're about £25 for one of these. It doesn't need ground lift. It doesn't need any buttons or anything. It's phantom powered, and I've been using them recently, and the noise floor is incredibly low. They're very, very, very nice indeed. And then that can feed into whatever mic preamps you have. I mean, the better preamps you have, the better, obviously. But beyond a certain price point, I do tend to find that most preamps sound pretty much the same unless you're driving them really hard. So, yeah, I mean, I've actually got a couple of Behringer's DI400 passive DIs, and they're not bad depending on what you're doing with them. I used them on this new upcoming Reaper Ultimate course, which is this massive 70-odd part course that I'm doing with Produce Like a Pro and the Pro Mix Academy. And I had a laptop in front of me, which was kind of the main production system, but everything was being recorded on the main studio rig, which is behind me. And I used two Behringer DI boxes, the passive ones, to take the sound from the Arturia audio fuse, which is in front of me now, and then pad that down and then convert that to mic level to send to the preamps behind me for recording, so I could get a real-time recording of it whilst I was talking to the camera and being filmed. And they sounded absolutely fine, you know. I wouldn't have trusted the onboard DIs on anything. The other thing is onboard DIs, unless it's a seriously, seriously expensive piece of equipment, are probably not shielded inside from the rest of the interface, which means that if it's not particularly high volume input going into that DI, then any noise that's going on, electronic noise, in that box is going to bleed on. And especially if you're doing like heavy guitars, that very quickly becomes a noise floor that you can really hear. Whereas if you have an external DI box, even if it's not an amazing one, it's getting the processing of that signal away from the rest of the electronics. And distance is always a good thing with electronics. If in the perfect world, your interface would be about a mile wide and every component would be about 100 yards away from the next. But then they would be connected by a theoretically perfect zero impedance cable. None of this is actually possible, but in ideal worlds, yeah, that's kind of how that would work. So, next, how do you use crossover splits in Reaper? Just started creating mixed buses and using crossovers. It's coming together but sometimes muddy. I find that the crossover eliminates mud, etc. Also, right, so I'll stop there. So you can use, you can do, say, one channel that's got a high section and one channel that's got a low section. That works. I don't tend to do crossovers on guitars myself because I tend to find that can screw around with phase. And if ever you've heard of crossover distortion and phase issues in crossovers, let's say you've got an EQ that's got a low filter on one track and an EQ that's got a high filter on another track, where they cross, there will be some phase issues because EQs inherently screw with phase. which means that section right there, wherever that crossover point is, might sound like it's kind of missing out of the overall overall sound, unless it's an absolutely perfect setup. So yeah, I would suggest just don't do a crossover. Use a little bit less gain than you thought you needed on your amp. Take out more low end generally on the signal than you thought you needed to take out. Because then let the bass guitar, which has a whole different EQ spectrum, make up for that fact. Your guitars will sound a little odd, a little bit thin, a little bit weak, until you bring that bass in, and suddenly it will make sense. Go back and listen to loads of classic albums in whatever genre you listen to, and listen specifically for this. Listen for the guitars. Listen for how much low end those guitars don't have. It will really surprise you. Go back, use your best headphones, listen to your guitar tone, then listen to stuff that you listen to in your genre, and be prepared to be surprised just how much low end is missing. But then it's not missing because the other instruments make up for that. So yes. Also, and a good question, I'm a sibilant vocalist. It's frustrating because being between the S's and the T's are some great spots. Any tips? Yeah, change microphone. That sounds flippant, but it sounds to me like you've picked a particular microphone that is bright, and especially with large diaphragm condensers, they don't have broad EQ lifts. What they actually have is several spikes at different points. And what that can do to the wrong singer is that can really accentuate the wrong things. If your mouth and your singing style and the way that you sing happens to interact with any of those presence spikes in that large diaphragm condenser, welcome to hell. It can be a real problem. What I would suggest, if you've got a little bit of a budget, is to try, if you can try getting the Slate ML1 microphone. They're amazing, because that's a large diaphragm condenser, but it's tuned to be relatively even across the board, and it's a modeling mic, but in a really good way, where I can, like, if I just add in here, I'm not actually using a Slate ML1, but I can pretend this is now a U47, which is a very mid-focused mic that's not got too many harsh spots. I can make it the Sony C800, which has some really nice, clear high-end, but doesn't overly do sibilance. There's the 251, which is my other favourite mic, and so on and so on and so on. There's even a SM7 with a tube stage model in there, which is nice, but the SM7, if you're lifting the high end on the SM7, some of those presence spikes that the SM7 has can really come out to play. Something that I've found, this is a bit of a soapbox rant, but I see a lot in forums where people say, I need a great vocal mic, I've not got a huge budget, what should I get? Far too many people recommend the SM7B. It's not a bad microphone, I'm not suggesting that, but let's say you're working on something that's really aggressive. An SM7B can be perfect for that, because you probably want a quite mid-forward microphone that's not got overly bright top end and really cuts through the mids. But what people then tend to do, if they're not experienced with an SM7B, is they tend to use EQs to really crank the high end. And let's just see what happens. I'm going to put a model of an SM7B in here. And just as an example, where's it gone? That one. So that's a model of an SM7B. I mean, yes, I'm using this on a dynamic mic anyway, so this does kind of defeat the point a little, but this is just to prove a point. If I grab the high end on this Neve and just go absolutely crazy with it, the top end sounds quite nice, but as soon as I do anything sibilant, the sibilance is just, even though there's a compressor there, it's jumping out at you. Sibilance. There you go. So that's absolutely crazy. Whereas if there we go, if I had a smoother microphone that didn't have too many of those presence peaks and then did an overall gentle high frequency lift, it's lifting everything equally and not just those sibilance points. So is that why your cymbal started sounding washy? Possibly, but I would also suggest that if your cymbals are sounding washy, you might be compressing those microphones too much. Whether you're compressing them on the mics themselves or on a drum bus, if you've been sucked into the belief that parallel compression is always good, it might be that your microphones on your cymbals have exactly the type of thing I was talking about just now with vocals, with kind of presence peaks that are standing out, and then by compressing that washiness can really be overbearing. So yeah, try compressing your overheads less. Try having smoother microphones. Try just generally not letting high end get the better of you, because that's the other thing, is you probably don't need as much high end as you think you do, which is what's bringing those sibilance things out. So there you go. Hot Jam Studios, long time listener, first time caller. Hello, I'm listening. Interface wise, am I still using my RME Radat? And would I still recommend it? Yes, I am, and yes, I would. Just to be very clear to anybody who's not up on what the RME Radat is, RME make a series of PCI Express cards for a computer called the Hammerfall range, and those go straight into the computer and they interface directly with the processor. No USB in between, no firewire, no nothing in between. It's direct, which cuts out a lot of issues that people are having with things like latency, with things like pops and crackling, which is generally dropouts, very short dropouts, because if you've got a USB interface or something like that, you're struggling with getting that from the sound from the interface through the USB and so on and so on and so on. And there you go. So yeah, getting through to the processor and back again can be causing problems. So I moved from a Focusrite Liquid Sapphire 56 when Firewire was officially discontinued, if not a little bit before then, because I was already struggling at that point, and moved to the RME system, and it was absolutely amazing. Turned out I was having further problems, but the further problems, it turns out, were the DVD drives in the computer were causing issues, so I removed them and everything was absolutely perfect and has been great since. But what the Radat card does not have is any physical inputs and outputs. It is just a card that has lots of ADAT connectivity, a bit of SPDIF and AES digital. It doesn't have any analog inputs and analog outputs. So what you then need to do to that is add converters and preamps and all that kind of stuff, and it becomes a fully modular system. So if you're going to buy a Radat, make sure you have preamps ready, make sure you have converters ready. If you have something like a Focusrite Octo Pre or something like a Behringer ADA 8000 or something like that, those are the type of thing I'm talking about, because those convert from analog microphone level to line level and then to digital, which can then be sent through to an RME Radat. And because that's using the ADAT system, that's got very, very low latency indeed. I think it's something like 3 samples of latency. It's crazy. Yes. So that's it. I'm still using the Radat, but what I'm using around it has changed over the years. When I first bought the Radat, I was using the Liquid Sapphire 56, but just using it as the mic preamps to conversion, and also sending an ADAT signal back to it to get 8 analog outputs for monitors and for headphone outputs and all that kind of stuff. That went. I've still got the old Octo Pre Mark II Dynamic that I had, which was really useful because that's got 8 analog outputs. I've got the Audient ASP 800, which is another 8 channels, of goodness, and that doesn't have any outputs on it though that come from the radar. And I've recently got the Arturia Audio Fuse 8 Pre, which is incredible, and that has an ADAT mode where it can send its 8 microphone preamp channels through to the radar card, and also a separate 8 channels out through the Audio Fuse's 8 balanced outputs on the back. So, yes, that's great, but I'm currently using the Audio Fuse at home in USB mode, which, with everything that's happened, has been a blessing. Really having that around, it's really helped out, because I think I've got 5 channels active right now, which is crazy for this tiny little space that I've got. Yeah. Bommel says he just sold his SM7B and got an RE20, which is a much more even sounding dynamic mic. Sold his Neumann, got an Antelope Edge Duo. Interesting. I'm still sticking with the Slate stuff, but if you prefer the Antelope stuff, hey, that works. Question from Vale Calzada. Do you know any methodology to create a suitable space in the mix? For example, there's a plugin called Track Spacer, but it only works under certain conditions. There is no good set methodology, and if anyone tells you there is, they're trying to sell you something, I think. The only methodology is, what instruments do you have in the mix? What frequencies can you hear that they're taking up? What other instruments do you have that should be taking that space? Like, if I've got an acoustic guitar and a vocal, I'm probably not going to have very many problems with space in a mix, unless I'm really heavily compressing them both, in which case they really both do tend to take that lower mid-range, where I might EQ out a little bit of low mid on the acoustic guitar to make space for the vocal, which is probably the focus. But if there is a methodology, it's just a series of questions. Question number 1 for me is always, what is the focus of the track at any given time? Because that can change. But generally, what is the key focus of the track? And generally, in the genres I work with, it's the vocal. And not necessarily the most important instrument, but what is the focus? Because if I've got really heavy raging guitars that have got loads of distortion, they might sound great, but if I try and bring in a vocal that's sat in the same frequency range and I can't hear clearly what's going on, I try and turn up the vocal, then it's too loud. I turn it down, it's not loud enough. That's also a key indicator that you've got fighting frequencies. But at that point, if I'm finding that, I tend to find that if I've got a focus instrument, I try and get the vocal or whatever it is level with other instruments where they all sit nicely together, and start turning on and off groups of instruments. And if I turn off a group of instruments and suddenly I go, everything just works apart from that instrument that's missing, the instrument that's missing needs some EQ work. And all I have to do then is turn it back on and turn it off and on, off, on, off, on, and just listen for what is it that's getting lost. Is it the top end clarity of my focus that's getting lost? Is it the mid-range forwardness that's getting lost? Is it low mid body that's being lost? If it's low end that's being lost, generally I should probably just take that low end out of the focus thing. Like so you'd be surprised how much low end is missing out of vocals in a mix. You track a nice vocal and it's got loads of bass, loads of low end. That's nice. You listen to it in a full mix, that low end's all gone. Why is that? Because other instruments need space down there. Okay, so that's kind of a bit of a thing. Can I do a comparison between the new PSP Infinistrip and Slate VMR in the future? Only if you guys can convince PSP Audioware to send that to me, because I don't have an unlimited budget to send, to buy everything, to try everything, unfortunately. I wish I did, I really do. But if you guys can convince PSP Audioware to send me the Infinistrip to compare the two, then I'm sure I could bring some sort of video together on that. Am I using analyzers while mixing, and when? How do I use them? Not really, no. Once I've got my monitoring set up properly, my volume set properly, something like SonarWorks definitely helps in terms of getting the right overall balance, whether it's on headphones or monitors or anything. I try not to use analyzers wherever possible unless I'm doing some sort of teaching and showing people where something is, because I've been doing this for a while now, and not necessarily, I wouldn't say I just know or anything so presumptuous, but I spent a lot of time listening for certain characteristics in certain instruments and looking for where those frequencies are that match, and it almost every time is in the certain range that I thought it was. So I tend to just be very quick with, like, if I listen to a vocal and it's got that's too much 500 hertz or round there, somewhere round there. So I very quickly will get a semi-parametric EQ, set round there, turn it up, and then just kind of change the frequency subtly until I find the strongest signal of offending frequencies, and then dip that a little bit, and then I'm done. So yeah, don't tend to use analyzers when I'm mixing. I did when I was learning, but in a way, a lot of that's either training wheels, or it can make you overthink processes where a lot of it has to be quick, has to be natural, so that your ears aren't getting fatigued by every single decision. How do you group drums when mixing down? Running out of room in a hellish knot of tracks, thinking of grouping mics in left-right groups and having everything in a submix. I do have all my drums in a submix. In fact, if I've got two overhead mics, I'll subgroup them. I've got two room mics, I'll subgroup them. I wouldn't group mics in left and right groups, but I tend to interleave my overheads in rooms anyway. I tend to think of drums in kind of banks anyway. I might have 3 microphones on the kick drum, but they go kick, kick, kick. Then I've got 3 on the snare, go snare, snare, snare. Might be 2 on the top, 1 on the bottom on the snare, 1 inside, 1 outside, and a sub mic on the kick, whatever. I might have 19 toms, but if I have them in a row going, so if I see the strip of toms and I can just identify them all going left to right, it doesn't matter how many I have, because I can just see that they go like that. Then I have like hi-hat, ride, overheads, room mics in a specific order, and then that all is in a drum subgroup. I can very quickly solo all the drums or solo an instrument. So yeah, I use Reaper's folders a lot. I'll just show you how I would do that. So let's just make a ton of tracks. So if I was to have, so this is going to make you dizzy, but if I went, let's just lean forward a bit, kick in, kick out, kick, sub, snare, top, snare, bottom, snare, top 2 for if I had a condenser on top, tom 1, tom 2, tom 3, tom 4, hats, ride. Keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going. Nearly there. So I'm going to move my thing up there so you can see overhead left, overhead right, room left, room right, and let's say I had a trash mic as well. So that's a ton of microphones, right? So this looks absolutely terrifying. Let's just make them all a certain color. Blue. Okay, so the first thing that I would do is have a drum group. So I'd make another track called drum group. I'll just hide the mixer, because what I can do is if I just shift click all of these, I can bring these up in Reaper into what is now a folder. So now that's a drum group folder. If I make another one, just call it kick, I can have all 3 of the kick drum tracks in a kick group. I could do the same with the snare. So I've suddenly got 3 mics in the snare group. I could have toms and have as many toms as I possibly want in a tom group. I could do the same for overheads, and I could do the same for my room mics. And suddenly, that doesn't seem quite so terrifying after all. So suddenly I've got kick, snare, toms, hats, ride, overheads, room mics. That's easy enough to work with. But then if I need to edit or volume change a specific microphone, I've got them all. So there you go. That's how I would do that in Reaper, and I know there are ways of doing that in other DAWs. I know Pro Tools can be a bit tricky doing that with a million auxes and buses. But yeah, I do this all the time. I do this with guitars as well, where I might have 3 microphones on a heavy guitar on each side, but I can then have them subfolded so that those 3 mics become 1 track, and then those 2 hard pan guitars become a single track on a folder. That way I can do a gentle broad EQ on the entire folder, but if I need to change the level of a specific microphone, then I can just go in and just gently do that. And you end up with 200 or 300 tracks on a Reaper project. But if I look on here, an extra little Reaper trick is if I right click on the master, there is a little button I can press, clickable icon for folder tracks to show and hide children. So once I've recorded all of this and once it's done, let's just say I could just dip down the kick, snare, toms, these little buttons, and suddenly that looks reasonable. So I've got 7 things I'm looking at for the drums. And then when the drums are done and I'm happy with the mix, I can press the down button on that, and that becomes a single drum group folder. And then I can then just make that nice and small so that I can then move on to mixing what else I was mixing and not have 200 tracks that I'm wading through trying to find what I'm looking for. And at the same time, if I ever need to go back and change anything, I just open that little subfolder up and go. So there you go. What do I think about EQ cheat sheets? I think they help somewhat, but you cannot take them as gospel. You can't take them as the absolute truth and nothing else will ever be true, because you will be disappointed very quickly. You'll find that, like, say, on a vocal, it's got like boxiness here, nasaliness here, that kind of thing. That really depends on the singer, depends on the microphone, like I was saying earlier with presence peaks and how much they accentuate certain things. It can depend on a number of things. But they are, as a general guide, kind of helpful. I used to look at those kind of things when I was studying at university, and they kind of helped. But after I'd left and started actually mixing for real, they kind of went in the bin. Because they help, but you can't look at them for inspiration. You've got to use your ears with the knowledge that you've learned to try and, what's the word? Just feel it. Yeah. Any frequency hotspots for instruments? Nope. It's entirely instrument dependent, microphone dependent. Even it can be that frequency hotspots, they don't really exist. You might find that there's a frequency buildup if you had, like, let's say I had 20 tracks of vocals that were all the same singer and the same microphone. Chances are there's going to be a hotspot in there somewhere, because that microphone has a presence peak somewhere, and that singer's probably got a bit of something that lines up with that. Times that by 20, and suddenly that's going to be like, whoa. Whereas if I had 20 different singers in front of 20 different microphones and added all them together, probably wouldn't have the same EQ buildup in the same space, because the different microphones and different singers would have different presence peaks that worked in different places. Perfect example is listen to harmonies on Queen records. Listen to the start of Bohemian Rhapsody, which is all Freddie Mercury, and notice how there's a particular kind of mid build-up that you can actually hear where they've EQ'd out quite a bit of mids on that because it was getting overbearing. Whereas listen to other Queen sections where it's Freddie and Brian May and Roger Taylor, and there's no such mid cut because each one of those vocals had its own distinctive presence peaks that all just sat next to each other rather than building up, and made for quite what you might call a pleasant harmony. So, one from Chris. Hi, Chris. Dream instruments and gear. Oh, that's getting tricky. For me, I think I would absolutely love a custom drum kit, something like a Sonar SQ2 with 24-inch, 14-inch deep kicks, two of them, something like 6 toms, bell brass snare, probably not too far from what Gavin Harrison has as a drum kit, actually. What else? As a bass, I think I'd like a Dingwall, but I've got access to a Rickenbacker 4003. I've got my trusty jazz bass. Maybe a nice elite jazz bass and a couple of really nice 6-string basses, but that's just widdly stuff. In terms of guitars, I need something with an Evertune, that's for sure. If it was money no object, I would ask PRS to make me a Tremonti with an Evertune, and just pay them whatever it took for them to do it. Dream gear, I mean, more ML1s and ML2s, because I really love the Slate stuff. I mean, honestly, I used to hanker after like Telefunken 251s for microphones, but now the Slate ML1 sounds the same. I genuinely don't, because I don't want the hassle of having this thing that's worth too much that could potentially break when I can get that sound out of something that won't. I would love an early revision dual rectifier. Lots more cabs from Zilla. I've already got the 5150 and the JCM 800, so I'm getting very close. Fender Twin, Roland Jazz Chorus JC 120. So there's a list. I mean, if we're talking dream gear, I'd love a Neve 88 RS desk. But then at that type of money, I'd probably get the Audient desk because they're much more reliable generally, unless it was a new Neve desk. And I'm getting to know the people at Neve, and they seem like really nice people. But yeah, what's my go-to stereo mic set for acoustic guitar nowadays? Honestly, SE Electronics SE8s. They're just about as close to a Neumann KM 184 as you can get without a lawsuit. So having said that, it was either a choice between them or Neumann KM 184s. They just sound great. Or Slate ML2s if you can get two that work properly and work flawlessly. With a choice then between... you've got a choice then between changing them from the AKG 451s, which are bright as hell, which can be perfect for a pop song, to the Sherps M222 tube small diaphragm condenser. So yeah. Any suggestions for someone who's deaf in one ear but will never stop mixing? Yeah, just keep mixing the same way everybody else does. Just make sure that you're recording more guitar parts or rhythm parts than you need, and making sure you're hard panning them. Just check that the performances, bring them into the middle and check that they line up timing wise if you can only hear out of one ear. then just spread them out EQ wise, and you will still find that you've got the space for the mix. If you've been mixing forever, then go with your gut still. Just make sure that, like I say, you're still doing panning, even if you're not aware of it. Just use the mono button. Like in Reaper, there is a button on the master down the left here for mono, which will quickly just fold everything down so you can just check it. This is getting quite a list here. In versus out of the box, what's worth buying on a budget? Good preamps, monitors, headphones, blah 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 blah. I would start with everything in the box. That's what I did. Then start with a great interface, is the best you can afford. Whether it's something like a 2-track, like an Audient Sono, which has great preamps, including a Valve preamp, so that's one of these. Or something like the Arturia Audio Fuse 8 Pre. I'm really impressed with this thing. So something like that. Then good instruments, good microphones. Good DIs don't have to be expensive. Like I was showing you the Orchid Electronics ones before. Get a couple of those for like £50, $50, however much it is. Amps, you can go virtual these days if you want. I would, an analog bus compression. Again, they're getting so good now that you generally, it's not worth spending the money on unless you can afford thousands of pounds of conversion. If you can't afford really high quality converters to go out to analog gear and back in, don't buy the analog gear, because it will be let down by poor analog to digital conversion. You are better off, in my opinion, staying digital with some of the really great offerings that are on offer now, unless you can afford the thousands of pounds for the conversion to justify the thousands of pounds of analog gear. Because, good quality digital plugins, in my opinion, sound better than medium to poor quality analog equipment, and have done for years. If you can afford the really, really good analog gear, and you can afford the really good converters to justify the round trip, then by all means do that. But that's the top 1%, and that's not on a budget. If we're talking thousands, we've probably gone out of most people's budgets. We've gone out of my budget. I work entirely in the box. I could run 16 outs when I'm mixing and do loads of buses, run them out through my Allen and Heath desk, and then through my BBC handmade 70s preamps to get some more flavour on them, and then back in. And I don't, because it would be a huge amount of time I would have to invest just to set all that up. And then I would have to be absolutely certain that that was giving me a sonic benefit. And it's got to that point, again, in my opinion, where we're really, really fighting the digital guys here. I mean, in terms of bus compression, if I load up Slate's virtual bus compressor rack right here, so you're now hearing me through their version of an SSL bus compressor, which if I just bring that threshold down, there we go. And then you're also hearing me through, oh, hello. This is going to start doing pops and clicks because I'm running at relatively low latency whilst now running through 3 compressors. But now you're also hearing me through a Fairchild 670 and a Focusrite Red 3 compressor. And on a mix that can sound as good as the real deal. I mean, I'm absolutely killing it here with my vocal, but it's, Although I've come to the realization and revelation that I don't mix through bus compressors. Bus compression, it turns out, doesn't really work for me. At least not much. And when it does, it's very, very little. Because I tend to run into mix bus saturation and tape machine, and I tend to run a relatively compressed and saturated set of tracks anyway, because I do love compression on separate tracks. I don't need any more compression on my mix bus. That's a conclusion that I've come to recently. So yeah, that's my conclusion anyway. I'm getting way off topic. What do I think about Yamaha HS7 for studio monitors? They're okay. They're nothing to write home about. I'm not sure if they justify their price point. They have absolutely no low end extension. Be aware of that. Their low end is not there. Probably in that price range, I'd be looking at something like Kali Audio's LP6s anyway, because they'll give you a much more accurate, full representation of the audio spectrum. Why am I drinking your domestic beer? It was cheap. I was in the supermarket because with the whole lockdown thing that's happening right now, I think I've been out twice since it started, and I found myself in the local supermarket, and they had a case of these going cheap, and so I grabbed them. And yes, it's an American beer, but this is actually made about 30 miles from where I live. And Hughes Bush, who own Budweiser, excuse me, I hiccup when I drink cold drinks, have a UK brewery in the north. And yeah, so it's all made actually closer to me than most UK beers. And yeah, it was cheap. And especially with everything that's happening, I can't be affording to go round looking for artisanal breweries, considering most of them are probably shut right now anyway. So, you know, I go through phases anyway. I went through a big red wine phase a couple of years ago. I went through a small whiskey phase for about a week and a half at one point. And I went through an ale phase for about 10 years. So I'm just kind of having a little time out. But I think I've got quite snobbish because working in pubs alongside doing the music stuff that I've done for a long time, I've come to the realization that I don't really like bottled ales. I'm a big fan of cask ales. If you can give me a freshly tapped pint of bitter or a blonde or a golden straight from a cask, that is so different from a bottle that it's almost a completely different beast. And if I'm going to drink from a bottle or a can, I may as well drink something cheap. So, cheers. So, which band do I think has the mix to match or beat Chris's two? Would be Meshuggah's Clockworks and Bring Me the Horizon's Chelsea Smile. Both good choices. I actually do quite like, in terms of a mix, Bring Me the Horizon's new single Ludens, which is the single they did for the Hideo Kojima. Oh, what was it called? Someone will say in chat, I'm sure. Death Stranding. There we go. Yeah. They've got really heavy guitars in there, which talk about surgical EQ cuts. There's no overbearing top end on those guitars at all, but they don't sound muffled. It's very clever. So that's a very nice balance for me. But it's not a genre I tend to work in very much, that electronic kind of thing where I think because that song had a lot of electronic elements, that subtly gives you a lot more free reign as a mix engineer to do quite drastic EQ decisions because the ear isn't used to a certain sound. In terms of a band, in terms of a mix to beat, oh, there's a few. If we're just talking absolute beast of a heavy thing, I mean, there's competing mixes. If I'm going for super clean and clinical, something like Genesis by Devin Townsend from his latest album is very clean, very clinical, but also an absolute wall of sound. The latest Dream Theater album is surprisingly big sounding. Their mix engineer is actually their live sound engineer, a guy called Jimmy T. And so they've got this massive sound now where suddenly I can hear the bass with a clanking top end. The drums sound huge but don't sound fake. I mean, the guitars, that's John Petrucci. That just sounds like John Petrucci. That was probably the easiest part of that mix for them. So there's yeah, check out something like Untethered Angel by Dream Theater on the most recent record, because that is a mixing masterclass. It sounds huge. There are no samples. There's no sample reinforcement or anything like that on the drums. It's just that Mike Mangini genuinely hits the drums that hard. The bass is nice and clear, which is a big deal for me. I'm a big fan of clear, aggressive bass parts. Maybe S2N from that album is a better example. Signal to Noise, because that's got a really aggressive bass part, complex drum parts, a lot of Hammond organ and different keyboard parts that fit quite well. Yes. Let's have a look. So Bommel's question: should you buy headphones directly from Sonarworks? Perfectly corrected headphones sound promising. If you've got a good headphone amp to drive your headphones, I think I would suggest that actually. I've been thinking for a while now that I want to send these old battleships off to Sonarworks, but these, I'll show you one side. That's how HD 650 should kind of look, except that it's absolutely battered on that side. This side, the thing's completely missing. Although it is partly aesthetic and partly just a guard for the rest of the assembly, it doesn't actually affect the sound, that part. These things have seen some battering. I saw the other part of this around at some point. I can't remember where it was. It pops in if you give it enough force. But yeah, I really want to send these off to be analysed, because these have been literally round the world with me, these headphones. And I think at this point, if there is such thing as speaker break-in, these are properly broken in at this point, and I'm so used to the tone of these headphones that I think that helps me mix. But then if there's anything that needs correcting on this particular pair that is outside of the remit of a general theme, which is what you get. I'll bring up Sonarworks again. This is the correction curve of an average set of Sennheiser HD 650. So there's a big 2K presence dip that doesn't exist, but also it looks like there's a tiny bit too much 1K on these headphones generally, which I have actually noticed. A bit strident at the 5K range, but something missing at the 7K range. And that reflects exactly what I've always found out of these headphones. Even though it is only a couple of decibels, it's far better than any other set of headphones I've ever used for mixing specifically, but still not perfect. Whereas if I simulated before, there we go, the before. So the before at the moment is actually this big, thick grey band. And what that means is, I don't know, I mean, this is kind of the rough range in which the average pair of 650s sounds, because they've tried several pairs and they've all come up within this range. But they've not measured my headphones specifically, so it could be 3 dB out either way. So yeah, I definitely would either buy headphones directly from them pre-calibrated or send these in to be calibrated. I definitely think that that's something that would pay dividends over time if you already really get on with a certain type of headphone and really know that that's the pair you want to use as well. Because that's the other thing. If I just went to Sonarworks and bought a pair of, I don't know, Bayer DT770s and just bought those from them, I don't think I would like them. And it's not because of what Sonarworks would do. I've had a pair of 770s. I found that they made my head sweat and they made me feel slightly claustrophobic. And that's not because of the EQ curve, that's because of the design and the extended periods for which I will wear headphones, especially when I'm editing. I much prefer open backs. I've always liked the feel of these particular headphones, and I've had the best part of 10 years getting used to the feel of 650s. These are my jam now, so yeah. Ooh, next question. Making some really hype covers of hip hop songs, genty as hell. Wondering about the legality of it. I'm changing the song a ton. Is it fair use, or do I have to pay through DistroKid? If it's a cover, it's a cover. There is no getting around that. If you are covering somebody else's song, it doesn't matter how much you change it, it is still their song. The fact that you know it's their song means it's their song. So through DistroKid, you would have to pay the cover license, which for that song, it's $1 a month. It's not exactly going to break your bank. But yeah, just keep that in mind that, yeah, if you change the words on a song, it's still that song. If you change the structure of a song, it's still that song. The only way round that in any way, shape, or form is to contact the publishing company who published the original song and see if you can work out a deal, and that may cost you a lot. So your best bet, if it's going up on YouTube, generally they'll pick it up as, oh, this is a cover, and the money will go to the right people. Well, all the money will go to people, but yeah, there's no way around it. I mean, the legality of it is if you put that song out there and claim it's your own, despite the fact that it's somebody else's song, it doesn't matter what you've done to it, that is illegal because it is not your song. I mean, you can talk about what if all the time, but yeah, that is not your song. But if you put something out and say, this is a cover of this song, you're not going to be paying the original artist who recorded the song because it's not their recording, but you do have to pay some publishing money to the songwriters to license using their song. That way, they get paid, you get paid, everybody gets paid, everybody's happy. And generally, DistroKid is a really good way to do that because they have these automated licensing systems that save you a lot of money because you're not having to hire a specific, licensing legal team or anything like that, which can get costly fast. The way that I used to be in a ska band back when I was at university, and the way that we got round this, and this is kind of pre-Spotify, this is just before streaming became a big thing, maybe 15 years ago now, give or take. Anyway, I'm old, and what we did is we sold a CD when we did a tour, and the CD was all of our own music, and it came with a free CD, which was a bonus, which was free, which had our covers of Under the Sea from The Little Mermaid and Ghostbusters on it. And those two songs were the songs we were best known for. Imagine doing a ska version of Under the Sea with a full brass section and stuff like that. It was kind of like Streetlight Manifesto, but British. And because we were giving them away for free, there wasn't anything that anybody could do because we weren't making money off it. And it wasn't even legally. It wasn't. We weren't selling them as pay us £5 for this CD, and it also comes with this CD, because then that's technically a bundle and that's technically a sale. We would be selling you our CD for £5, and then because it was in person, we could then go, oh, have a free cover CD. Which then technically kind of counts as an amateur work that we were doing for fun and no money was trading hands. So yeah, there we go. So yeah, like Leo from Frog Leap, he uses songs under license all the time. Yeah, So yeah, DistroKid are probably the best for most of us. To keep it simple, DistroKid is a really good way to license songs, but Leo from Frogly he might be with a specific label or something like that because he does so many at such a high level with such a high number of sales. He will probably have a method of doing that. Yeah. Oh, if you're going to sign up to DistroKid, 1 second. Kid slash VIP. I think that's my link. Yeah. So if I just type this in chat, just distrokid.com/VIP/hoppole. That's our DistroKid link, and if you use that, then you get 7% off your sign up to DistroKid anyway, and we get a kickback. So it's good for everybody. Yeah. So yeah, that's the logistics. DistroKid, you pay, I think it's $20 a year for your account, and then you can upload as many albums and songs as you want. But if it's a cover, you have to declare it's a cover, and for that particular song, you pay, I think it's $1 a month. And yeah, that then adds up. So that's $12 a year for a cover song, and that's it. Done. And any money you make, you then make. So yeah, top 5 free VSTs. Ooh. Number 1, if you don't use Reaper, Reaper's plugins called the Replugs can be downloaded from the website, from Reaper's website for free. And you can use them then with anything that will load VST up. So you can use stuff like Restream, which is what I'm sending. Restream is actually streaming via a local method the audio from this Reaper project through to OBS. You then get the compressors and multiband compressors and impulse response loaders, which is Reverb, and Reaper's EQ, which has that, which has the real-time analyzer built in. That's all really good and is free. So that's number 1. Number 2, MT Power Kit is a really good free drum VST that's got some really good sounding drums in it and costs you nothing. Stephen Slate Drums Free Edition is free and is really good, so why would you not? That's Contact Player, because there's some really good instruments that you can get for that for free, which anything from synths through to pianos through to anything. And I'm struggling to think of a free 5th one. What have I got? Let's see. Unfortunately, most of what I use right now is all kind of paid. Come on, brain. I mean, I could recommend demos to you, but they're no help to anybody. Pretty sure Waves do some free plugins that are quite useful, like the VU meters have helped me a couple of times. But yeah, putting me on the spot a little bit. Technically speaking, Amplitude 4 is free. Amplitude 4 has got a really nice couple of amp sims in there. So it's got the Fender style American Tube Clean, but it's also got has it got a bass amp in there? Yeah, so it's got bass amps and it's got a really nice Marshall in there actually. It's a pure amp British Tube Lead. So they've got a free version of a JCM 800 in there, which isn't bad. Oh, BOD Bass Overdrive is a really good one. Thank you, David Ross. Yes, that's one that I used to use a lot before I switched to using Parallax from Neural. Oh yeah, 2 Notes Wall of Sound is currently free right now. So if you've got a real guitar amp, or if you have even a virtual amp that you want to change a cabinet on, you can use Wall of Sound from 2 Notes, which includes not free, but most of the cabinets that I've made. So there's the Cheap State was one that I thought was really funny. That's the old Banter Media logo from about 2010. But because it's ours, I kept it, which is cool. But those are actually €8 for a cab, or if there's any sales on, you can get them for even less than that. There's the Tall Beast, which is one of the Zillas. Which, if you find one like the Big Beast is a 4x12 Zilla. If you like those and you can get them for €8 instead of the 40 or whatever it is for the GGD Zilla stuff, then hey, there's a really good alternative for you. It's funny. A few years back now, and I mean years, I asked Paul from Zilla specifically if I could use the Zilla name to make cabinet impulse responses. And his first response was, not sure, I don't really know what that is. And so I tried to chase him up on it, and then he said, well, I can't because someone else got there first, and that was Adam Getgood, Nolly. And we're all gentlemen. I just said, you know what, okay, cool. Because there's nothing to be upset or offended over or anything. I'd asked if I could do something that was a bit cheeky, and Nolly had got there first. Cool. But years were starting to go by, and I was like, well, nothing's come out. Can I do this? And then they actually went to Middle Farm Studios for all the captures, and then GGD Zilla is finally dropped. And it is decent. It is good. So, yes. Let's see. Savvy Optician. Do I play winds at all? Trumpeter beside playing instruments for my metal projects. I am not. I play a lot of instruments, but things that you blow are generally not things that I play, unfortunately. I'm not very good. I don't do any brass. I used to play recorder as a child, but I have some, mental scarring from recorder lessons at 4 years old. And no, but I have recorded trumpets a lot. And one of the joys of being a recording engineer is that you don't necessarily have to be able to play something to not only be able to record it, but have to record things on the spot. I've recorded things from trumpets and bugles all the way through, the standard rock and roll fare. I've recorded gospel choirs. I've recorded church pipe organs. I've recorded vocals whilst the church pipe organ is blasting. I've also recorded Vulcan harp, I kid you not, Vulcan as in Star Trek, through an iPad app live whilst that person sang and played. Oh, God. So, yeah, you learn quickly and go, right, well, this is a sound source. This sounds like this. What qualities do I want from this instrument? What room are they in? What situation are they in? What's bleeding into the microphones? Do I need to stop things bleeding into the microphones, or is that okay? I don't know if you were around. I think it was last week, Mr. Savvy Optician, that I mixed a song called "Call Me Up," and that had some trumpets in there that I'm really kind of proud of. See if I can find the recordings of that, because that was nearly 10 years ago now. But the mix was something that I was really kind of chuffed with. Let's see if I threw a mix in. There we go. I did. So I'll just turn the volume down on this a little and just bring it up. There we go. So there you go. Yes. Some real nice, bright sounding trumpets. Question from RTV. So I started really early in life with music. Do I have perfect pitch? Um, yeah, kind of. Um, I don't like using the term perfect pitch because it's something that I had to learn. I was not born with it. I I've always had an aptitude for instruments, but as a double track trumpet and a flugel. So yes, yes. But sorry, getting back to talking about the whole perfect pitch thing. Um, I was always quite good with instruments as a kid, but it wasn't necessarily just, oh, he's gifted. It was, I was obsessed. And I was 10 years old and I had this toy keyboard and I could barely tap out notes on, but I would then constantly spend my days thinking about major and minor intervals. I didn't know what they were called, but I would then uh, work all that out, and eventually I could do 2 or 3 fingers at the same time. And then I got piano lessons, so I could then do one hand and one finger, and hated it. Generally, hated all that kind of stuff. But then, by the time I was 14, I was really obsessed with playing guitar and playing bass specifically. And bass for me requires a good sense of pitch to be able to pick out not just what notes the other players are playing, but then have the intuition of where you should be going. And it's the kind of thing where I decided that I should learn what different keys sound like. So what I did, I don't even know where I got this idea from. I started listening to 3 or 4 of my favorite songs at the time just on loop, but then just listening to a section on loop and just deciding, like, the start, for instance, of Bomb Track by Rage Against the Machine, which is in E, is my reference in my head for what E sounds like. And I listened to that so many times that it was etched into my brain like a tattoo on the inside of my skull. So if I talk about that song now, right now, I have an E in my head, and that's da, because Rage Against the Machine's Bomb Track goes do 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 do, and in my head that is exactly how that goes. And so I could sing that in my head to myself and then play what's supposed to be an E on my instrument. And if what I'm playing doesn't match what I'm singing, I can change the tuning of the instrument until it matches what I hear in my head. And generally speaking, I'm pretty close. And then D became Between Angels and Insects by Papa Roach. It was the year 2000, please forgive me. There was Freak on a Leash by Korn. The midsection is in A. That ba-da-dum-bum-bum-ba-ba-ba. Something takes a part of me. I mean, I was big into new metal, and this was 2000, 2001, so those were my references. And from there, I learned something in C. I can't remember what now. G, and then a few others. And then from there, if someone told me I need an E flat, I would think of my source for an E, think of my source for a D, and then try and go halfway in between them. And there's your E flat. Because if I'm doing if it's supposed to be higher than the D but lower than the E, by a quick process of elimination in my head, there's my E flat. Or if I try and bring up my reference for the E in my head and it's a little bit higher, must be an F. And so I don't memorize 13 different or 12 different pitches, but I have enough references in my head that I can go close enough that I can very quickly work something out. So it's not perfect pitch, but it's close enough that then that gave me a very strong foundation, I think. That from there, I really started to get into studying music theory, because being 14, 15 years old, I then started studying music for exams, that kind of stuff, and started getting taught about counterpoint, which for a bass player is, it opens up worlds, and proper intervals, and yeah, being taught about stuff like if you play a fifth chord and then there's a seventh, the seventh makes you want to move down, and so on and so forth, and inversions and all that kind of stuff. Suddenly, that really helped, and being able to then harmonize with people, because I was being put into school choirs all the time because as part of the music crowd, that's what you do. I then had to improve because on a 2 or 3 times weekly basis, I would be put in a room with other singers and be expected to be one of the first to pick up on exactly where we should be and lead a small group in a choir, that kind of thing. So, yeah, I was tested a lot early on, but that test really made me get sharper and sharper and sharper and sharper because people were looking to me and relying on me, even as a 15-year-old kid, because as part of the music school or whatever you want to call it, that was, you know, if you can't do this, then what's wrong with you? So yeah. So yeah, from there I was then in bands and then went on to college and university and kept finding that having that ability and being able to reference things really worked for me and meant that I could very quickly pick out if someone wasn't playing something right or singing something right. I could pick out why, whether they were sharp, whether they were flat, whether I was sharp or flat. Generally, if I could hear myself properly. One of my biggest issues when I was at university, I was part of performance groups, was that I was constantly singing sharp and I couldn't work out why. And it turns out that the fallback monitors in these small rooms were so loud, like I was talking about earlier in the stream, they were pushing far too much SPL into my ears, and I was compensating for what felt like a higher pitch by singing too high. And so, yeah, I've developed what's close to what a lot of people call perfect pitch, but it's been blood, sweat, and tears. And it is something that I genuinely believe most people could do. But it requires a certain obsession and finding, like I said, certain references. There was some people are just genuinely gifted with it, and I find it jaw dropping when people are. I think it's great. There was there was a girl who was working behind one of the bars where I was doing live sound a couple of months back. 18-year-old girl, quite shy, doesn't sing in front of people, is singing in the back of the bar, and I can tell straight away because she's not singing to a track that it's perfectly on key, and I'm just like, hang on a minute, that's in key. So just to test the theory, I then asked her to sing me a section of a completely different song which hadn't been on the radio or anything, and that was perfectly on. And it was, that's right, it was Christmas, and I just said to me, sing the first opening lines of All I Want for Christmas Is You, and she went, I don't want a lot for Christmas, and it's just like, there it is, yep, perfect pitch. And for me to say that in the couple of sentences before I started singing that line, I was thinking, what's my key? What's my key? And it's ba ba da ba 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 da ba 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 ba. Is it G that song's in? F sharp? Yeah, I think it's F sharp. But yeah, close enough. So yes, hello to Soul Bastard 94. Thank you very much for the comments. One more before I go, because I was supposed to do this for an hour and it's been nearly 2. This is what happens on every damn stream. I saw that there were JSFX plugins in Reaper under the JS tab. Yes, let's pull them up. So JS effects in Reaper. Some of these are absolutely great. Some of them I don't have a use for. But there's loads and loads of these things, and they're all made in a little bit of code, and some of them are absolutely fantastic. And so, excuse me, that's the Budweiser talking. There are compressors in here that sound like 1176s. One that I use all the time, actually, this one called Event Horizon Limiter Clipper from Stillwell plugins. I used to really, really dig Stillwell plugins and use them a lot. And the Event Horizons, they're like master bus limiter. It does start to exhibit distortion before more modern, more expensive, and much more processor intensive master bus compressors. But what I use it for is I use it for the podcast. Every week, when we finish the podcast every Thursday, I bring the audio from the video, drop that in Reaper, and I'll slam Event Horizon on and just bring the threshold down, which auto brings the level up to compensate. And then if at any point anyone shouts or anything on the podcast, it just gently gets rolled off. And also, I mean, if I hit edit on this, I can actually see the code. I can genuinely look at all the that's it. That's the way that the plugin works. And so there's even Mr. Stillwell has documented it. So this is running live right now, and we can actually see. I mean, if I put Event Horizon on the master before restream, oh, did you hear how that got louder? There we go. So I'm going to take that down. But if I edit this, I can actually see on the right these values, which are just above where my head is. That's the current volume right there. And every time I talk or don't talk, this number changes. And there are different numbers going on. And you can actually see how this plugin is running live in real time. If I start changing numbers in the code, that will change the way the plugin works, which is absolutely incredible. I think he's been lazy there. He's only put pi into about 10 digits, but I suppose that's all you need depending on what he's using it for in his processing. But yes, the JS effects, some of them can be really useful. And if I've got like a 2-hour, 3-hour podcast, this is so not CPU intensive that it's a really nice master bus clipper just in case. And it means that I can still export to MP3 at 40 times real time, which means that I can have the podcast up on iTunes about 3 minutes later, but at a reasonable volume level for iTunes and Spotify, whilst also, not wasting lots of my time waiting for it so I can upload it. So yeah, JS effects, some of them are absolutely brilliant, and I'm going to take that off again. I implore you to check some of these out. There's some really simple ones, like there's a channel phase meter, which the channel phase meter is dead simple, and all it can do is, if I put the channel phase meter on the master bus, for example, it automatically tells me what sample rate a track's running at, which should be, I mean, in this case, it's 44.1 kilohertz. It tells me whether the output from that channel is mono or stereo. So I can drop this on. If someone sends me a stereo-looking track, but it's actually the same on the left and the right, it'll just say it's mono there. And if it's stereo, it'll change itself to either tell me that they are in phase or out of phase, or that it can't tell. So that's a really great, quick, free detection right there for whether something's, if someone sends you a track that's got phase issues and it keeps coming up saying stereo out of phase there, that is really, really useful. There's also like channel polarity control, which is so simple, but I can do things like I can invert one side of a stereo phase on a stereo track without having to add any really complex plugins or go diving deep anywhere. That's really helped me out before when someone sent me a track where one side, like say they've sent me a stereo overhead file and it sounds wrong. And the reason is that one of the sides has got the polarity flipped. But if you just press invert phase on the channel, that'll flip them both, which is no use because you've still got one out of phase, but it's the other one now. That can be a real time saver. There are different choruses. There's an audio to MIDI drum trigger, which you can use this live to generate MIDI to trigger drums without something like Stephen Slate drums or Slate's trigger. It's not quite as good as something like Trigger. You can clean up the audio beforehand using an EQ or something, but it's so CPU low. It's ridiculous. Yes, you can experiment and create your own plugins basing on these in Reaper. If you're into programming, you absolutely can. You can grab any of these and just mess around with the code, add more code. There's loads of them that can edit MIDI on the fly, which can be really, really good. With the quality of them, they are full quality. It just does exactly what you want it to do, and the quality is exactly the same as any paid plugin. It's just that it is specifically doing what you want it to do. So, yeah, quality is entirely subjective, but like I say, I use the Event Horizon clipper right there on my podcast every week, and it certainly doesn't diminish the quality. But yeah, there are certain bits of the code there that I could sit down and really study this, but I don't, because Mr. Stillwell has spent his time making sure his plugins sound good, and so I trust it and it sounds good, and that's all I really need. Let's see. Well, plugins. So, Stillwell plugins. I can't remember when, but at some point I bought a load of Stillwell plugins. But they're... I used the 1973 on a whole album several years ago, which is a really quite nice sounding Neve-ish EQ. I now realise it doesn't really sound like a Neve EQ because it doesn't have any of the saturation stuff in. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. It just sounds nice. And it's that the full license for it, for using with Reaper, is $25. I'll have to find my license keys for some of this stuff because I'm sure I bought most of these. And so, yeah, the pricing is typical Reaper type pricing where it's really quite low. But yeah, if you just want something like Event Horizon, I think this is a more sophisticated version of what's in the JS code. But it's, like $25 for the Event Horizon right there, which is really, really nice. So, yeah. I think that is about all I have time for this evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm still on my singular Budweiser, but thank you everybody for tuning in. It's been an entertaining couple of hours, and I'll probably do this again in a few weeks, if not in a month or two, and I'll start making this a regular thing because it's something I did promise was for patrons especially, that if they have any questions, do have a look at the Patreon, by the way, which I'm going to put that in chat, patreon.com/HotPoleStudios, because that's a support kind of thing that helps us to grow and helps us to keep doing what we're doing, especially in the situation that everybody's in at the moment. I've got more videos that are going to be coming out over the next couple of weeks. I'm going to be doing more live streams, probably one on Wednesday now. So, yes. Thank you very much, everyone, and I will see you all next time. Sorry I didn't get to the question about pickups, but that's something that's probably for someone more like Rabia Masad, so ask him that question. Ask me again if you see me on another stream, but for now, I think it's time to go. Thank you, everybody. Goodbye! Thanks for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this, feel free to check out our other videos, as you can find here, or check out our Facebook and Twitter,
or our Patreon page, which helps us to make more videos like this. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.